Howdy, squirrel listeners. Got a little dent in my hat there. Okay, let's see. I believe the last thing I said yesterday, or read yesterday, was the guy interviewing 5010 gave him his flask and he drank all of it. He said, but I don't think it was necessary for you to deprive me of all of mine. No, that is, you can appreciate. Oh no, actually I read this too, but that's okay. We'll do this. No, that is, you can't appreciate the necessity unless you have suffered in your life as I'm suffering. You were never sent up yourself. I gave him a glance which was all indignation. I guess not, I said. I have led a life that is above reproach. Good, he replied, and what a satisfaction that is, eh? I don't believe I'd be able to stand this jail life if it wasn't for my conscience, which is as clear and clean as it would be if I'd never used it. Would you mind telling me what your defense was? I asked. Certainly not, he said cheerfully. I'd be very glad to give it to you, but you must remember one thing. It is copyrighted. Fire ahead, I said with a smile. I respect your copyright. I'll give you a royalty on what I get paid for, on what I get for the story. Very good, he said. It was like this. To begin, I must tell you that when I was a boy preparing for college, I had for a chum a brilliant, fun-loving fellow named Haley Hicks. Hawley, or Holly Hicks, concerning whose future various prophecies had been made. His mother often asserted that he would be a great poet. His father thought he was born to be a great general. Our headmaster at the Scarberry Institute for Young Gentlemen prophesied the gallows. They were all wrong, though. For myself, I think that if he had lived long enough, almost any one of the prophecies might have come true. The trouble was that Holly died at the age of 23. 15 years elapsed. I was graduated with high honors at Brasenose, lived a life of elegant leisure, and at the age of 37 broke down in health. That was about a year ago. My uncle, whose heir and constant companion I was, gave me a liberal allowance and sent me off to travel. I came to America, landed in New York early in September, and set about winning back the color which had departed from my cheeks by an assiduous devotion to such pleasures as New York affords. 2 days after my arrival, I set out for an airing at Coney Island, leaving my hotel at 4 in the afternoon. On my way down Broadway, I was suddenly startled at hearing my name spoken from behind me, and appalled on turning to see standing with outstretched hands no less a person than my defunct chum, Holly Hicks. Impossible, said I. Exactly my remark, returned number 5010, to which I added, Holly Hicks, it can't be you. But it is me, he replied. And then I was convinced, for Holly never was good on his grammar. I looked at him a minute, and then I said, but Holly, I thought you were dead. I am, he answered, but why should I let a little thing like that stand between friends? It shouldn't, Holly, I answered meekly, but it's condemnedly unusual, you know, for a man to associate even with his best friends 15 years after they've died and been buried. Do you mean to say, Austin, that just because I was weak enough once to succumb to a bad cold, you, my dearest friend of my youth, the closest companion of my school days, the partner of my childish joys, intend to go back on me here in a strange city? Holly, I answered huskily, not a bit of it. My letter of credit, my room at the hotel, my dress suit, even my ticket to Coney Island are at your disposal. But I think the partner of your childish joys ought first to let in on the ground floor of this enterprise. and informed how the deuce you managed to turn up in New York 15 years subsequent to your, I'll look up this word. Oh, this one doesn't tell me how to say it, but it means funeral rites. Obsequies? Nah, that doesn't help me. Obsequies. Doesn't tell me where to put the emphasis on. Obsequious? I don't know. But anyway, funeral rites. Now, doggone it, it didn't take me back. Go back. Okay, here we go. 15 years subsequent to your funeral rites. Is New York the hereafter for boys of your kind, or is this some freak of my imagination? That was an eminently proper question I put in, just to show that while the story I was hearing terrified me, I was not altogether speechless. It was indeed, said 5010, and Holly recognized it as such, for he replied at once. Neither, said he, your imagination is all right, and New York is neither heaven nor the other place. The fact is, I'm spooking, and I can tell you, Austin, it's just about the finest kind of work there is. If you could manage to shuffle off your mortal coil and get in with a lot of ghosts the way I have, you'd be playing in great luck. Thanks for the hint, Holly, I said with a grateful smile, but to tell you the truth, I do not find that life is entirely bad. I get 3 meals a day, keep my pocket full of coin, and sleep 8 hours every night on a couch that couldn't be more desirable if it were studded with jewels and had mineral springs. That's your mortal ignorance, Austin, he retorted. I lived long enough to appreciate the necessity of being ignorant, but your style of existence is really not to be mentioned in the same cycle with mine. You talk about 3 meals a day as if that were an ideal. You forget that with eating, your labor is just begun. Those meals have to be digested, every one of them. And if you could only understand it, it would appall you to see what a fearful wear and tear that act of digestion is. In my life, you were feasting all the time, but with no need for digestion. You speak of money in your pockets. Well, I have none, yet I'm the richer of the two. I don't need money. The world is mine. If I choose to, I could pour the contents of that jeweler's window into your lap in 5 seconds, but here's another word. But
cui bono.
Cui bono, which means for what use, of what good. Okay, take me back. It did. The gems delight my eye quite as well where they are, and as for travel, Austin, of which you've always been fond, the spectral method beats all. Just watch me. I watched him as well as I could for a minute, said 5010, and then he disappeared, and in another minute he was before me again. Well, I said, I suppose you've been around the block in that time, eh? He roared with laughter. Around the block, he ejaculated. They love to use that word. I have done the continent of Europe, taken a run through China, haunted the Emperor of Japan, and sailed around the Horn since I left you a minute ago. He was a truthful boy in spite of his peculiarities, Holly was, and Serenes quietly, so I had to believe what he said. He abhorred lies. Well, that was pretty fast traveling, though, I said. He'd make a fine messenger boy. That's so. I wished I'd suggested it to him, smiled my host. But I can tell you, sir, I was astonished. Holly, I said, you always were a fast youth, but I never thought you would develop into this. I wonder you're not out of breath after such a journey. Another point, my dear Austin, in favor of my mode of existence. We spooks have no breath to begin with. Consequently, to get out of it is no deprivation. But I say, he added, Whither are you bound? To Coney Island. See the sights, I replied. Won't you join me? Not I, he replied. Coney Island is tame. When I first joined the Spectre Band, it seemed to me that nothing could delight me more than an eternal round of gaiety like that. But, Austin, I have changed. I have developed a good deal since you and I were parted at the grave. I should say you had, I answered. I doubt if many of your old friends would know you. You seem to have had difficulty in so doing yourself, Austin, he replied regretfully. But see here, old chap, give up Coney Island and spend the evening with me at the club. You'll have a good time, I can assure you. The club? I said. You don't mean to say you visions have a club? I do indeed. The Ghost Club, which is the title, is the most flourishing association of choice spirits in the world. We have rooms in every city in creation, and the finest part of it is there are no dues to be paid. The membership list holds some of the finest names in history. Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Napoleon Bonaparte, Caesar, George Washington, Mozart, Frederick the Great, Mark Antony. Cassius was blackballed on Caesar's account. Galileo, Confucius. You admit the Chinese, eh? I queried. Not always, he replied, but Khan was such a good fellow they hadn't the heart to keep him out. But you see, Austin, what a lot of fine fellows there are in it. Yes, it's a magnificent list, and I should say they made a pretty interesting set of fellows to hear talk. I put in. Well, rather, Holly replied. I wish you could have heard a debate between Shakespeare and Caesar on the resolution, the pen is mightier than the sword. It was immense. I should think it might have been, I said. Which one? The sword party. They were the best fighters, though on the merits of the argument, Shakespeare was way ahead. If I thought I'd stand a chance of seeing spooks like that, I think I'd give up Coney Island and go with you, I said. Well, replied Holly, that's just the kind of a chance you do stand. They'll all be there tonight. And as this is Ladies' Day, you might meet Lucretia Borgia, Cleopatra, and a few other feminine apparitions of considerable note. Oh, doggone. That settles it. I'm yours for the rest of the day, I said, so we adjourned to the rooms of the Ghost Club. These rooms were a beautiful house on Fifth Avenue. The number of the house you will find on consulting the court records. I have forgotten it. It was a large, broad brownstone structure and must have been over 150 feet in depth. Such fittings I never saw before. Everything was in the height of luxury, and I'm quite certain that among beings to whom money is a measure of possibility, no such magnificence is attainable. The paintings on the wall were by the most famous artists of our own and other days. The rugs on the superbly polished floors were worth fortunes, not only for their exquisite beauty, but also for their extreme rarity. In keeping with these were the furniture and bric-a-brac. In short, my dear sir, I had never dreamed of anything so dazzlingly, so superbly magnificent as that apartment into which I was ushered by the ghost of my... Another word coming up.
Quondam.
Quondam, which means former, one time. Friend Holly Hicks. At first I was speechless with wonder, which seemed to amuse Hicks very much. Pretty fine, eh? He said with a short laugh. Well, I replied in a moment, considering that you can get along without money and that all the resources of the world are at your disposal, it is not more than half bad. Have you a library? I was always fond of books, explained 5010 in parentheses to me, and so was quite anxious to see what the Club of Ghosts could show in the way of literary treasures. Imagine my surprise when Holly informed me that the club had no collection of the sort to appeal to the bibliophile. No, he answered, we have no library. Rather strange, I said, that a club to which men like Shakespeare, Milton, Edgar Allan Poe, and other deceased liter... I could probably figure that out.
Literati.
Literati. Literati. Belong should... Oh, I didn't tell you what that means. I'm sure it means having to do with literature. Just the plural of literatus. Acquainted with letters. Belong should be deficient in that respect. Not at all, said he. Why should we want books when we have the men themselves to tell their tales to us? Would you give a rap, R-A-P, the smallest amount, to possess a set of Shakespeare if William himself would sit down and rattle off the whole business to you any time you chose to ask him to do it? Would you follow Scott's printed narratives through their devious and tedious periods of Sir Walter? In spirit would come to you on demand and tell you all the old stories over again. In a tenth part of the time it would take you to read the introduction to one of them. I fancy not, I said. Are you in such luck? I am, said Holly, only personally I never send for Scott or Shakespeare. I prefer something lighter than either Douglas Jerrold or Marryat. But best of all, I like to sit down and hear Noah swap animal stories with Davy Crockett. Noah's the brightest man of his age in the club. Adam's kind of slow. How about Solomon, I asked, more to be flippant than with any other desire for information. I was much amused to hear Holly speak of these great spirits as if he and they were chums of long standing. Solomon has resigned from the club, he said with a sad sigh. He was a good fellow, Solomon was, but he thought he knew it all until old Dr. Johnson got hold of him, and then he knuckled under. It's rather rough for a man to get firmly established in his belief that he's the wisest creature going, and then after a couple thousand years have an Englishman come along and tell him things he never knew before, especially the way Sam Johnson delivers himself of his opinions. Johnson never cared whom he hurt, you know, and when he got after Solomon, he did it with all his might. I wonder if Boswell was there, I ventured, interrupting 5010 in his extraordinary narrative for an instant. Yes, he was there, returned the prisoner. I met him later in the evening, but he isn't the spook he might be. He never had much spirit anyhow, and when he died, he had to leave his nose behind him. That settled him. Of course, I answered, Boswell with no nose to stick into other people's affairs would have been like Othello with Desdemona left out. But go on, what did you do next? Well, 5010 resumed, after I looked about me and drank my fill of the magnificence on every hand, Holly took me into the music room and introduced me to Mozart and Wagner and a few other great composers. In response to my request, Wagner played an impromptu version of Daisy Bell on the organ. It was great, not much like Daisy Bell, of course, more like a collision between a cyclone and a, looks like simoon. Well, this doesn't show me anything. It's a very hot, dry, suffocating, and dust-laden wind that blasts across the African deserts. I guess that's what that is. That's what it looks like. and in a tin-plate mining camp, in fact, but nevertheless marvelous. I tried to remember it afterwards and jotted down a few notes, but I found the first bar took up 7 sheets of foolscap, and so I gave it up. Then Mozart tried his hand on a banjo for my amusement. Mendelssohn sang a half dozen of his songs without words, and then Gottschalk played one of Poe's weird stories on the piano. Then Carlyle came in, and Holly introduced me to him. He was a gruff old gentleman, and seemingly anxious to have Freud become an illegible, and I judged from the rather fierce manner, and it's Froude, so I may have pronounced that. Rather fierce manner in which he handled a club he had in his hand, that there were 1 or 2 other men of prominence still living he was anxious to meet. Dickens, too, was desirous of a 2-minute interview with certain of his present purely mortal critics. And between you and me, if the wink that Bacon gave Shakespeare when I spoke of Ignatius Donnelly meant anything, the famous cryptogrammarian will do well to drink a bottle of the elixir of life every morning before breakfast, and stave off disillusion as long as he can. There's no getting around the fact, sir, Serennes added with a significant shake of his head, that the present leaders of literary thought with critical tendencies are going to have the hardest kind of a time when they cross the river and apply for admission to the Ghost Club. I don't ask for any better fun than that of watching from a safe distance the initiation ceremonies of the next dozen who go over. And as for an Englishman, sir, who thoroughly believes in and admires Lord Wolseley, if I were out of jail and able to do it, I'd write him a letter and warn him that he would better revise his estimates of certain famous soldiers no longer living if he desires to find rest in that mysterious other world whither he must eventually betake himself. They've got their swords sharpened for him, and he'll discover an instance when he gets over there in which the sword is mightier than the pen. After that, Holly took me upstairs and introduced me to the spirit of Napoleon Bonaparte, with whom I passed about 25 minutes talking over his victories and defeats. He told me he never could understand how a man like Wellington came to defeat him at Waterloo, and added that he had sounded the Iron Duke on the subject and found him equally ignorant. So the afternoon and evening passed. I met quite a number of famous ladies, Catherine Marie Louise, Josephine, Queen Elizabeth, and others. Talked architecture with Queen Anne, and was surprised to learn that she never saw a Queen Anne cottage. I took Peg Woofington down to supper, and altogether had a fine time of it. But, my dear Serennes, I put in at this point, I fail to see what this has to do with your defense and your trial for stealing spoons. I'm coming to that, said 5010 sadly. I dwell on the moments passed at the club because they were the happiest of my life, and am loath to speak of what followed, but I suppose I must. It was all due to Queen Isabella that I got into trouble. Peg Woofington presented me to Queen Isabella in the supper room, and while Her Majesty and I were talking, I spoke of how beautiful everything in the club was, and admired especially a half-dozen old Spanish spoons upon the sideboard. When I had done this, the Queen called to Ferdinand, who was chatting with Columbus on the other side of the room, to come to her, which he did with alacrity. I was presented to the king, and then my trouble began. Mr. Serennes admires our spoons, Ferdinand, said the Queen, The king smiled and turning to me observed, "Sir, they are yours. Waiter, just do these spoons up and give them to Mr. Cyrenes." "Of course," said 5010. I protested against this, whereupon the king looked displeased. "It's a rule of our club, sir, as well as an old Spanish custom, for us to present to our guests anything they may happen openly to admire. You are surely sufficient well acquainted with the etiquette of club life to know that guests may not with propriety decline to be governed by the regulations of the club whose hospitality they are enjoying." "I certainly am aware of that, my dear king," I replied, and of course I accepted the spoons with exceeding deep gratitude. My remonstrance was prompted solely by my desire to explain to you that I was unaware of any such regulation, and to assure you that when I ventured to inform your good wife that the spoons had excited my sincerest admiration, I was not hinting that it would please me greatly to be accounted their possessor. "Your courtly speech, sir," returned the king with a low bow, "is ample assurance of your sincerity, and I beg that you will put the spoons in your pocket and say no more. They are yours." I thanked the great Spaniard and said no more, pocketing the spoons with no little exultation, because, having always been a lover of the quaint and beautiful, I was glad to possess such treasures, though I must confess to some misgivings as to the possibility of their being unreal. Shortly after this episode, I looked at my watch and discovered it was getting well on towards 11 o'clock. I sought out Holly for the purpose of thanking him for a delightful evening and of taking my leave. I met him in the hall talking to Euripides on the subject of the amateur stage in the United States. What they said I did not stop to hear, but offering my hand to Holly, informed him of my intention to depart. "Well, old chap," he said affectionately, "I'm glad you came. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I hope we may meet again sometime soon." And then, catching sight of my bundle, he asked, "What have you there?" I informed him of the episode in the supper room, and fancied I perceived a look of annoyance on his countenance. "I didn't want to take them, Holly," I said, but Ferdinand insisted. See how much more I got. I think I may stop right. Yeah, I think I'll stop right there for the day. What did I just say? Ferdinand insisted. Okay. All right. I hope y'all have a lovely day. It's Thursday, so I won't be on today, but look for me tomorrow, 5. Friday, live at 5. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Love ya. Bye-bye.